On a sweltering afternoon in the capital of Ouagadougou, time seemed to freeze as the national broadcaster aired a never-before-seen clip. General Michael Langley, the commander of the U.S. Africa Command AFRICOM, stood before reporters and delivered a statement that sent shockwaves across the Sahel. He accused the president of Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, of using the country's gold reserves to strengthen his military regime. Behind Langley's diplomatic smile was a veiled warning. "We know what you're doing." It wasn't just a political statement. To many Africans, it was a declaration of war. A question immediately erupted across social media and international news outlets. Why would the United States, a self-proclaimed guardian of democracy, openly attack a young African leader who had just helped steer Burkina Faso away from chaos and reclaim national sovereignty? Inside the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely in his 30s, sat silently watching the screen. Not a single reaction. But those close to him knew the storm had begun. This wasn't merely a confrontation between two men, but a clash between two worlds. One of entrenched global power, and another of nations rising yearning to control their own destiny. This video is not just news. It's a story of power, of resources, and of survival. And in that story, Captain Traoré is more than the protagonist. He is the symbol of a new struggle in which Africa refuses to stay silent. Outside the palace walls, the city buzzed with rumors. Traoré had yet to respond to Langley's accusation, and the silence was deafening. In the corridors of power, advisors debated retaliation strategies, while intelligence agents intercepted unusual chatter from embassy channels. Someone had triggered something bigger than a press statement. Just 2 weeks earlier, an unmarked plane had landed at an isolated airstrip in the north. Aboard were crates of encrypted communications gear, advanced rifles, and men who spoke neither French nor English. They were escorted to an abandoned garrison, later listed in government logs, as training personnel for rural security operations. Unofficially, they were specialists from a nation with no embassy in Burkina Faso, but with a clear interest in disrupting Western dominance in Africa. For months, Traoré had watched. He knew the patterns. First came the media smear, then the NGO reports, then the sanctions, then if you didn't bend the drones. He wasn't going to wait for step 4. If the game was rigged, he would flip the board. In a dramatic midnight address streamed live, but announced with no warning, Traoré emerged in military fatigues. His voice was calm, but his message cut deep. "Our gold is not a gift for outsiders," he declared. "It is the sweat of our people, and no foreign general, however powerful, will dictate how we use it." The response was instantaneous. Thousands poured into the streets, waving homemade signs. "Langley is not our president. Traoré is Africa." In cities across the Sahel, spontaneous demonstrations erupted. In Mali, youths painted murals of Traoré dressed as a lion. In Niger, military commanders issued statements of solidarity. Meanwhile, inside a secure Pentagon conference room, red alerts blinked across digital maps. One analyst murmured, "We've lost the narrative." Another, more blunt, "He's turning into Sankara 2.0. But Traoré wasn't just echoing Sankara's dream, he was building a new playbook. Behind the scenes, his government had already begun renegotiating mining contracts, slashing foreign licensing fees by 70%, and offering new joint ventures, but only with nations that respected full sovereignty. China and Turkey responded first. Russia sent a delegation, the West silence. The Americans, however, weren't idle. Diplomatic cables revealed intense lobbying at the African Union. Offers were made, threats were implied. A high-ranking AU official was recorded saying, "They're treating this like a virus, and Traoré is patient zero." At the same time, whispers of covert action intensified. A former intelligence officer in Accra hinted on a late-night radio show that somebody might disappear soon. The comment was quickly dismissed as conspiracy, but in Ouagadougou, the presidential guard quietly doubled. Tension in the capital reached boiling point. Every speech, every convoy, every camera movement felt choreographed. But this wasn't theater, it was preparation. Traoré knew the script. He'd studied what happened in Libya and Haiti and Venezuela. And this time, the ending would be different. The ground was shifting. Not just in Burkina Faso, but across a continent tired of being watched, judged, and manipulated. The world had seen a leader rise before, but never one so young, so defiant, and so willing to risk it all for the right to stand on his own land and say enough. It happened in Addis Ababa. The annual African Union Summit had drawn leaders from across the continent, presidents in tailored suits, generals in full regalia, ministers armed with curated speeches and media-ready smiles. And in the middle of it all, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, still in his signature military fatigues, flanked by 2 security officers from his personal guard. He didn't blend in, that was never his intention. The tension was already thick. Rumors had spread that AFRICOM operatives were on the ground lobbying member states to issue a formal condemnation of Burkina Faso's government. The agenda was supposed to focus on regional security, but behind closed doors, Langley's shadow loomed. Then came the moment during a closed session, live-streamed only to delegates. The chair of the AU, reading from a pre-approved statement, questioned Traoré's constitutional legitimacy and urged a return to democratic norms, but it was what followed that turned the room ice-cold. A diplomat widely known to be a close ally of Western interests stood and asked Captain Traoré, "Do you intend to rule with rifles and rhetoric, or are you willing to lead with responsibility?" The tone wasn't inquisitive, it was accusatory, condescending, deliberate. For a moment the room fell into silence. Some averted their eyes, others smirked. It was humiliation, public, precise, and purposeful. Traoré didn't flinch. He stood, looked around, then walked slowly to the center of the hall. No microphone was needed, his voice carried with the weight of fire. "You want to speak of responsibility," he said, eyes locked on the diplomat. "Then let us speak not in whispers, but in truths." The hall shifted. Cameras clicked on. Someone in the back pressed record. 2 weeks ago, Traoré continued, a classified briefing was circulated among AFRICOM strategic partners. It detailed the steps required to restore Western-friendly order in Burkina Faso. Step 1, media delegitimization. Step 2, internal dissent, fueled through covert economic disruptions. Step 3, targeted destabilization via military provocations disguised as counterterrorism. Delegates stirred. Some leaned forward. Others pulled out their phones. This was no longer protocol, it was theater. "What your general failed to mention," Traoré pressed, "is that this operation is already underway. Grain shipments to the north were mysteriously lost due to logistical issues, just days after our mining reform. Our national currency reserves were suddenly frozen by a foreign bank, citing irregularities that no one can explain. And just last night, our border patrol intercepted 2 unmarked drones flying low over military installations, drones manufactured in a country that has never sold to us." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. "And now," Traoré said, voice steady, "you ask if I intend to lead with responsibility." He turned to face the entire chamber. "Responsibility is defending a nation that was left to rot under your watch. Responsibility is standing firm when the lion's den closes, in refusing to kneel, even when the jackals arrive dressed as diplomats." He paused. "Let me ask you all, when a people choose to stand on their own feet, when they reclaim their land, their voice, their gold, does that make them criminals or simply inconvenient?" The silence was deafening. The same room that had moments ago indulged in political theater now sat frozen in a collective realization they were witnessing a rupture in the script. "We are not anti-West," Traoré said, tone shifting. "We are anti-subjugation. There is a difference. And if the price of independence is your disapproval, then I will wear it like armor." One by one, a few delegates began to nod. A few stood, then scattered applause. By the time Traoré walked back to his seat, the tide had turned. That night, the video of his speech was leaked. Within hours it went viral. Traoré truth trended in 3 continents. In Dakar, students held candlelight vigils. In Nairobi, a protest broke out in front of a Western embassy. And in Washington, General Langley was called into an emergency Senate briefing. A single question echoed in the room. Did we just make him a hero? But Traoré wasn't celebrating. Back in Ouagadougou, his team was already bracing for impact. Intelligence confirmed a spike in encrypted traffic from neighboring states. A coordinated pressure campaign was forming, diplomatic, economic, maybe even military. But this time Traoré was ready. He had exposed the playbook, and more importantly, he had rewritten the ending. 48 hours after the AU summit, a black helicopter touched down atop the Ministry of Defense in Ouagadougou. A man in civilian clothing stepped out clutching a biometric lock briefcase. He wasn't from the West, that much was clear. He came bearing a classified dossier, not from Langley or Paris, but from Moscow. There are at least 3 African governments compromised by U.S. intelligence, the advisor said. Burkina Faso is one of them. Captain Traoré didn't react. He had suspected it since 2 of his personal guards disappeared after a confidential meeting. A week later, the encrypted government network was breached. Power grids were interrupted 3 times, no explanation. But now he had proof, and he wasn't about to stay silent. Within 72 hours, a sweeping internal purge was ordered. Every senior officer trained in NATO countries was placed under review. Military servers were decoupled from Western satellites. New encryption protocols were deployed, written in code languages, shared only with regional allies. A new unit was born, the People's Guard, composed of soldiers from border villages, loyal only to Burkina Faso. But Traoré knew that defense alone was not enough. The war had already started, not with bombs, but with banks and headlines. 5 international financial institutions withdrew investment within 2 weeks. On CNN, BBC, and RFI, Traoré was branded as a radical military strongman, an authoritarian populist, a destabilizing figure. In response, Traoré launched a 24-hour public broadcast channel, La Voix du Peuple. It didn't just stream government announcements. It gave the mic to farmers, factory workers, students. In one viral segment, a woman from Kaya stood before the camera and said, "I never imagined a president would speak like someone from our street." That sentence hit harder than any press release from Washington. Meanwhile, in the Golden Triangle, home to 80% of the country's gold reserves, a strange force emerged. Armed with Western-made weapons bearing no flag, they attacked a military checkpoint and killed 7 soldiers. International media described them as unidentified militants. But 3 days later, the Ministry of Defense released drone footage. One of the attackers was seen being evacuated by a vehicle with diplomatic plates from a Western embassy. The footage went viral. Doubt turned into rage. Banners appeared overnight. "We're not fighting terrorists, we're fighting their sponsors." Traoré convened the High Security Council. 2 paths lay ahead: close the country, completely withdraw from the AU, suspend all Western treaties, or strike back. He chose both. Within a week, Burkina Faso signed a strategic compact with Mali and Niger. The Sahel Sovereign Bloc was born, a trilateral security, economic, and intelligence alliance. Together, they issued an earth-shaking declaration. All 3 nations would withdraw from the CFA franc currency zone, calling it a colonial leash. At a press conference, when asked if he was building a rogue coalition, Traoré simply smiled. "No, I'm not building anything. We just stopped being afraid." But across the Atlantic, silence was broken. A leaked Pentagon memo labeled Burkina Faso a critical disruption to global strategic interests. An audio clip surfaced online, a senior U.S. official's voice. "If we don't break him now, there'll be 10 more Traorés in the next 5 years." In his office, Traoré listened to the recording. He didn't speak for a long time. Then, turning to his aide, he said, "Then we must live long enough to greet every one of them." In the dim war room, beneath the presidential palace, Traoré stood alone, before a massive digital map of the Sahel. Every flickering red dot told a story: troop movements, intercepted communications, unexplained satellite anomalies. But what haunted him most weren't the enemy positions. It was the silence in the data, the things not recorded, the allies who'd gone quiet, the deals made in shadows. "They're not just circling us," said Colonel Yara, his chief strategist, stepping into the room. "They're waiting for us to make the wrong move." "Then we give them a move they won't forget," Traoré said. He reached for a sealed folder marked Doctrine 9, a contingency plan drafted in the earliest days of his rule, considered too radical by some, suicidal by others. But times had changed. The war was no longer hypothetical. Over the next 72 hours, operations were launched simultaneously across the region. First, an energy accord was signed with Algeria, a gas pipeline deal that bypassed all Western intermediaries. Then came a digital strike. Burkina Faso's cyber unit, trained by regional engineers and reinforced with open-source intelligence, disabled 5 proxy servers used by foreign surveillance agencies to intercept West African data. No physical damage, just silence, the kind that causes panic in intelligence rooms. But the most symbolic strike came not from soldiers, but students. In Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako, coordinated protests were launched outside French, American, and EU consulates. Not violent, not chaotic, just thousands of young people holding one message: "We are not your chessboard." The world was watching, and not all were amused. That same week, a document leaked from the European Commission revealing a proposal to suspend aid, impose travel bans on Sahel leadership, and reroute humanitarian programs through select trusted NGOs, code for influence channels, the stated goal: pressure through isolation. But Traoré was 2 steps ahead. In a televised address, he announced the Doctrine of Defiance, a political and economic manifesto that redefined the nation's trajectory. Burkina Faso, he said, will no longer participate in frameworks built to manage our dependency. We will build new ones, grounded in dignity, not charity. We will accept aid, but never conditions. We welcome partnerships, but not masters. Let this doctrine be clear: those who respect us will find allies. Those who threaten us will find history has changed. The speech hit the world like a thunderclap. In Ghana, thousands gathered at the border in solidarity. In South Africa, artists projected Traoré's image onto apartheid-era monuments. In Latin America and Southeast Asia, social media erupted with hashtags linking their own struggles to the Sahel's awakening. "This is no longer African," one Indonesian user wrote. "This is human." Meanwhile, Langley's office in Stuttgart buzzed with controlled chaos. A fresh satellite report showed convoys moving near the Burkina border, not military, but humanitarian. But they were escorted by local militia, and they refused inspection by international observers. The line between civilian and soldier was blurring by design. AFRICOM issued a private advisory: do not engage directly. Traoré is baiting escalation. The battlefield is legitimacy, and he's winning. But cracks began to show. In Côte d'Ivoire, a pro-Western president faced internal dissent as youth wings questioned the CFA franc. In Senegal, opposition parties began demanding audits of foreign aid pipelines. What was once fringe rhetoric had become mainstream. Traoré hadn't just survived, he had shifted the center of gravity. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré walked alone through the People's Plaza. No guards, no convoy. He greeted vendors, listened to students, took notes in a worn notebook. "They say I'm a dictator," he told a young poet who recited verses on sovereignty. "But I've never ruled anyone. I only made it safe for them to rule themselves." That night, an emergency communique arrived. An unmarked convoy was spotted near the Ghanaian border. Radio silence. Strange heat signatures. Possible foreign special forces. "Should we scramble interceptors?" his advisor asked. Traoré shook his head. "No," he said. "Let them come, and let them see the one thing they cannot defeat." "What's that?" the advisor asked. "A people who have already decided." The morning sun rose over Ouagadougou like a final verdict, silent, searing, and unblinking. The air was heavy with stillness, as if the city itself knew that history was about to tip. At the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood atop the observation deck, hands behind his back facing the horizon. Below him, the People's Guard lined the perimeter, not with fear, but with silent determination. School children marched with flags. Vendors set up their stalls like any other day. And yet it was not any other day. Intelligence reports confirmed what the general already suspected: a convoy was moving in from the east, fast, covert, likely foreign. Their presence was unacknowledged, their mission unspoken, but their intent was clear. This was no exercise, it was a test. But Traoré had stopped playing by their rules long ago. In the main courtyard, a crowd gathered. Citizens, farmers, teachers, engineers, and elders stood shoulder to shoulder. Some carried radios, others carried stories, all carried one message: we decide. That morning, with no advance announcement, Traoré stepped into the public square and addressed the nation directly. No podium, no teleprompter, just a voice, calm, clear, and unflinching. They thought they could scare us, starve us, shame us. They sent threats wrapped in handshakes, soldiers disguised as saviors. But we have learned something dangerous, something irreversible. We have learned to see through the silence. He pointed toward the east, where the invisible line of foreign presence lingered like a bruise. They want submission, he said. Not because they fear us, but because they fear what we represent. If one small nation can refuse, then others might remember how. He paused. The silence was loud. Burkina Faso is not a perfect country. We are wounded, poor, struggling, but we are awake, and we will not go back to sleep. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in unity. 1,000 voices echoed a singular truth: we are not afraid. At that moment, drones buzzed in the sky, not enemy scouts, but local media. They streamed the speech live to a continent desperate for direction. In Lagos, students watched from rooftops. In Johannesburg, activists held impromptu screenings. In Cairo, subtitles were added and re-uploaded before Traoré even left the stage. But in Washington, a very different meeting was taking place. We miscalculated, one official admitted. He didn't collapse, he multiplied. AFRICOM's contingency team offered one final option: discredit, a leak, a scandal, an accusation, but nothing stuck. The more they pushed, the more resilient the narrative became. Traoré wasn't just a man anymore. He was a movement. He was myth in motion. In the weeks that followed, Burkina Faso's economy didn't collapse, it adapted. Local cooperatives expanded. Gold was traded through new regional channels. Cryptocurrency trials were launched, using solar-powered nodes in rural zones. The Sahel was still poor, but for the first time, it was poor on its own terms. Schools revised curricula. Children were taught about Sankara and now Traoré. The military was no longer just a force, it was a memory of what it meant to protect, not control. Meanwhile, the convoy that had been approaching stopped at the border. No shots fired, no orders given. Perhaps it was hesitation. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was something deeper: recognition that what lay ahead was no longer a battlefield, but a mirror. And so it ended, not with an explosion, but with endurance. On the final page of his personal journal, Traoré wrote one line: "A free man dies once. A nation that forgets how to be free dies every day." He didn't seek monuments. He didn't build palaces. What he left was more dangerous than power. He left possibility, and in that possibility others began to rise. In Guinea, a young journalist quit his job at a state-run broadcaster and founded an independent news channel called Eco Afrique. Its motto: no signal without sovereignty. In the Congo, a mayor replaced a French development contract with a local community initiative, citing the doctrine of defiance as his reasoning. In Kenya, university students added Traoré's name to their protest chants, alongside Mandela, Sankara, Lumumba. The storm did not come. because it had already passed, and what remained was the silence after revolution, not emptiness, clarity. One evening, as the dry season winds, howled across the savannah, an elder from the north sat with his grandchildren under a tree, and told them there was once a soldier who refused to kneel, and because of him we now know how to stand. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, as chronicled in this gripping narrative, offers more than a political account. It is a profound lesson in leadership resistance and the rebirth of national consciousness. At its core, the saga of Traoré is a demonstration of how one individual committed to justice and dignity can become the catalyst for continental transformation. His story reveals critical lessons not only for Africa but for all societies grappling with the legacy of external dominance and the thirst for genuine sovereignty. The first and perhaps most resounding lesson is that leadership rooted in moral conviction is far more powerful than leadership dependent on foreign approval. Traoré's refusal to bend to General Langley's accusation and implicit threats marks a radical departure from decades of African leaders who often compromised under international pressure. His calm but firm response, "Our gold is not a gift for outsiders," struck a deep chord. It served as a reminder that national resources must first serve the people who own them. Leadership, when exercised responsibly, means standing firm, even when the cost of doing so invites uncertainty and danger. Secondly, the narrative highlights that silence can be both a strategy and a weapon. Traoré's decision to withhold immediate comment after Langley's accusation allowed a wave of spontaneous public solidarity to emerge. This silence, pregnant with meaning, forced observers and opponents alike to consider the gravity of what had occurred. It became clear that Traoré was not merely reacting, he was orchestrating a deliberate and dignified resistance. This teaches us that measured silence, when used judiciously, can shift narratives more powerfully than rash words. Another important lesson lies in Traoré's understanding of modern warfare, not through arms alone, but through narratives, media, and economic instruments. From drones to disinformation, from sanctions to diplomatic isolation, the tools used against Burkina Faso were non-traditional but devastating. Traoré's strategic launch of La Voix du Peuple, a state-run media channel that gave voice to ordinary citizens, served as a counter-narrative mechanism. He realized that reclaiming sovereignty also meant reclaiming the story, and in doing so, he rendered many conventional tools of manipulation less effective. This reflects a crucial insight. The battle for legitimacy in the 21st century is often fought not on the battlefield, but in the media and digital spaces where truth is shaped and shared. Furthermore, Traoré's actions underscore the transformative power of symbolism in politics. His choice to wear military fatigues at the African Union Summit, his unannounced midnight addresses, and his walk through public plazas without a security convoy, these were not just gestures. They were calculated acts of political theater designed to communicate defiance, accessibility, and authenticity. By refusing to conform to diplomatic conventions, he reshaped public perception and redefined what African leadership could look like. The lesson here is that symbolic gestures, when grounded in integrity, can galvanize national pride and create emotional bonds between leaders and their people. Additionally, this narrative sheds light on the importance of preparing for asymmetric confrontation. Traoré did not merely react to Western provocations, he anticipated them. His creation of the People's Guard, his investment in cyber capabilities, and the swift enactment of the doctrine of defiance all speak to a proactive governance model. In the face of destabilization, Traoré fortified not only his state apparatus, but also the psychological resilience of his people. He turned national defense into a shared civic duty, thus decentralizing resistance. The strategic foresight he demonstrated provides a compelling lesson in leadership under siege. Preparation is not paranoia, it is protection. Moreover, this account emphasizes the deep connection between sovereignty and dignity. Traoré repeatedly refused to engage with international institutions that offered aid with strings attached. Instead, he forged new partnerships based on mutual respect, and regional solidarity. The founding of the Sahel Souverain Bloc and the withdrawal from the CFA franc system represent bold economic decisions rooted in ideological clarity. Traoré was not merely reacting to external control, he was constructing alternatives. The lesson is clear: true independence is not simply the absence of colonial masters, it is the presence of indigenous systems designed and governed by local realities. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Traoré's story is the contagious nature of courage. His actions resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. In cities across Africa and beyond, his name became a rallying cry. Youth protests, academic discussions, artistic tributes, and political debates began to reference him alongside historic icons such as Lumumba and Sankara. His defiance inspired not just admiration, but action. A young journalist founded an independent news channel in Guinea. Students in Kenya chanted his name during protests. This ripple effect proves that a single act of bravery, when grounded in justice, can awaken a multitude. The final and enduring lesson comes from the very last lines of the story. A free man dies once. A nation that forgets how to be free dies every day. In these words, we are reminded that freedom is not a passive condition, it is a daily practice, a mindset, a cultural commitment. Traoré's life choices and leadership call on all citizens, not just presidents, to reclaim agency over their nation's futures. He reminds us that the fight for sovereignty is not merely political, it is existential. It is about preserving the soul of a people, the memory of struggle, and the right to imagine futures on one's own terms. In conclusion, the story of Ibrahim Traoré is more than a record of recent history. It is a blueprint for how to lead with purpose, resist with wisdom, and inspire with authenticity. It teaches that even in the face of global giants, one principled leader, backed by a united people, can bend the arc of history. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the future belongs not to the powerful, but to the courageous. As viewers across Africa and beyond watch the events surrounding Captain Ibrahim Traoré unfold, reactions poured in from every corner of society, villages, universities, markets, homes, and online platforms. What emerged was not merely support or criticism, but a wave of reflection that transcended political ideology. This was not just about one man or one country. It was about dignity, memory, betrayal, and awakening. Many viewers felt an immediate sense of pride. A farmer in Mali said, "I have never met this man, but when I see him speak, I see someone who understands what it means to fight for the land, to protect what feeds us. He talks like one of us, not above us." That sentiment echoed throughout rural and urban communities. For decades, citizens had grown accustomed to seeing their leaders bow under pressure, accept foreign dictates, or speak in abstract language far removed from daily struggle. But Traoré was different, raw, unpolished, and unafraid. In university lecture halls across Africa, students debated the implications of Traoré's moves. One political science student in Nairobi remarked, "This is post-colonial theory in motion. For once we are watching a leader who is not theorizing freedom, he's living it. And that's why they fear him." Another added, "When the AU session was leaked online, I watched it 3 times. Not because it was a great speech, though it was, but because it gave me the courage to believe again." We always read about Sankara, but now we are witnessing another chapter of the same book. Yet the conversation wasn't one-dimensional. In Accra, a teacher expressed concern, "I support his courage, but I worry. When you go against the world order, you put your people at risk. Sanctions don't just hit governments. They hit mothers, schools, hospitals. I hope he knows the burden he carries." This sentiment was common among those who had lived through coups, embargoes, and failed revolutions. They admired Traoré, but they feared the consequences of standing tall in a world that often punishes the defiant. Still, many were moved by the emotional authenticity of Traoré's addresses. A factory worker in Dakar shared, when he said, "We have learned to see through the silence. I felt it in my bones. We've been lied to for so long about aid, about development, about democracy. Finally, someone says, what we whisper at home. In marketplaces and social gatherings, Traoré's words were quoted like poetry. His speeches became more than news, they became tools of empowerment. Online platforms amplified these voices. On social media, hashtags like cite Traoré Truth, Doctrine of Defiance, and We're Awake trended for days. A user from South Africa wrote, "This is no longer just about Burkina Faso. This is about all of us." Traoré represents a psychological rupture, a moment when we realize we don't have to ask for permission to be free. Another post from Uganda simply stated, if one man can break the script, maybe we all can. Young people in particular saw in Traoré a new kind of leadership. He's not old and tired, said a student in Kinshasa. He's young, alert, informed. He doesn't quote foreign philosophers, he quotes the people. This mattered deeply in a continent where many presidents are aging relics of a different era, and youth often feel sidelined or silenced. But perhaps the most striking response came from those who never thought of themselves as political. A street vendor in Bamako explained, "I don't watch politics, but I watched him, because when he speaks, I feel like maybe my children won't have to go through what I went through. Maybe they'll grow up with their heads high." This is the power of representation when leadership speaks not from ivory towers, but from within the community's soul. Reactions were not limited to Africa. In Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe, viewers drew parallels between Traoré's stand and their own historical struggles. A Colombian activist wrote, "Watching him, I remembered Bolívar. They always try to kill the ones who wake us up." A Filipino social worker added, "This isn't just African courage, it's human courage. This is what it means to protect the dream of your people." Of course, not all comments were uncritical. Some viewers raised questions about transparency and governance. "Charisma is powerful," said a journalist from Lagos. "But what systems is he building? It's not enough to reject the West. What comes after revolution must have structure." Others warned against personality cults. "He is inspiring," one observer from Addis Ababa noted, "but he must stay accountable. We've seen too many heroes become tyrants." Still, the majority of voices seem to converge on one theme, a shared emotional awakening. Traoré's story pierced through cynicism. It broke through decades of disappointment and replaced it with a fragile but determined hope. A retired soldier from Niger reflected, "I never thought I would see this day. After all the lies, all the betrayal here, comes a man who says no, and means it." What Traoré ignited was not just political, it was spiritual. "He speaks like a prophet," said a woman from Ethiopia. Not because he tells the future, but because he reminds us of the past. We've forgotten the strength of our ancestors, the pride in our skin, the will to decide. The emotional impact of the final speech, when he pointed to the east and said, "They want submission, not because they fear us, but because they fear what we represent," was especially profound. That line was repeated in sermons, in songs, and even painted on classroom walls. One teacher from Togo wrote, "I made my students memorize that paragraph, not for politics, for life, because it teaches you never to let fear shape your choices." In the end, as the story circulated from phone screens to radios, from classrooms to community gatherings, one message became clear: whether or not Traoré succeeds in reshaping Burkina Faso, he has already changed something fundamental. He has reminded people from the poorest street to the highest hall that they are not powerless. As one young boy in Ouagadougou said, after seeing Traoré walk through the city without guards, "I didn't know presidents could walk like us." That sentence, perhaps more than any speech, captured what the story meant to the people, a rediscovery of possibility. And once possibility is known, it cannot be unseen.